Hello, I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute at Washington State University. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today, which will feature Professor Bruno Baltodano speaking about inequality in Bolivia, elections and indigenous self-determination. Today's event is part of our ongoing series at the Foley Institute this semester, looking at the politics of inequality. That series began last week with a distinguished lecture from Sir Angus Deaton from Princeton University. And our future events will feature Joe Sauce from the University of Minnesota, Chris Farrisee from Syracuse, Amber Wachowski from Marquette, and many others. If you'd like more information about this series or any of our events, you can visit us at foley.wsu.edu. And if you miss any of our events, you can see them later on our YouTube channel. And that's the Foley Institute's YouTube. Finally, let me just thank the College of Arts and Sciences at WSU for their continued support of the Foley Institute and their support of this series. Now, it's my pleasure today to introduce Bruno Baltodano, who is a professor of political science at Florida Southwestern State College in Fort Myers, Florida, where he teaches classes on international relations, comparative politics, and American government. His academic research centers on insurgencies with a particular focus on indigenous land rights and political autonomy in Latin America. Professor Baltodano is the co-author of the book, The Role of Female Combatants in the Nicaraguan Revolutions and Counter-Revolutionary War, which was published by Routledge Press. And he has published many articles in major journals of political science, including Conflict and Communication and Latin American Policy. Dr. Baltodano's recent research in Bolivia, which will form the basis of his talk today, was funded by Florida International University and made possible by a grant from the United States Department of Education to the Kimberly Green Latin American Center and Caribbean Center. Finally, let me note that it's something of a homecoming for Bruno. You'll notice from his tie, he received his undergraduate degree from Eastern Washington University and his PhD from here at Washington State University. We're proud that he's one of our alum. So it's a real pleasure for me to welcome Bruno back to the Foley Institute, if only virtually today. Bruno's indicated he plans to speak for about 30 or 40 minutes, after which we'll have some time for some questions. And if you have questions, I encourage you to send those to me at tsfoley@wsu.edu. Again, it's tsfoley as in Tom S. Foley @wsu.edu. So Bruno, I'm going to turn the time over to you now, and I'll be back later with some questions from our audience.
Thank you, Dr. Clayton. I want to start by giving thanks to the Foley Institute and both to Richard and to Dr. Clayton who made this talk possible, and also to Florida International University LAC, Latin America Study for Latin American and Caribbean, as well as their High Andes program. And particularly three women who have been very supportive in making this not only this presentation but the project itself a reality. That's Liesl, Lindsay, and Maria Luisa. And finally, I just want to take a moment to give thanks to and express gratitude to Dr. Martha Cottom, who's retiring from Washington State University. She was not only my professor as a grad student, but also a mentor in that was instrumental in not only showing me how to do the right thing because it's the right thing in the classroom, but also in field work. Thank you, Martha. So we had a little bit of difficulty with my laptop, so I'm in a cell phone and so Richard Elgar will upload my PowerPoint presentation. So let's see if we can do that. So as I mentioned, this presentation titled Inequality in Bolivia, Elections and Indigenous Determination in Bolivia was born out of a project in which I was part of a cohort that was put together and supported by FIU. We traveled to Bolivia to conduct interviews, but related to this presentation and this talk, this project of mine, we were also asked to be observant to the territorial elections in Jesus de Machaca, which is a region, an indigenous Aymara region, close to Lake Titicaca, to give you a sort of a regional image. And this picture that you see on the screen right now is from that day. It's a fantastic opportunity to see local election and to learn about what community democracy and community feminism means in Bolivian, in Aymara terms. But it's also an interesting connection because, as it happens throughout Latin America, politics and religion oftentimes go hand in hand, more so than we are used to in the United States. And so this election occurred following one of the most revered celebrations in Aymara calendar, Aymara and Quechua as well, and that was the celebration of the New Year's Day, what they call in the high Andes, the Inti Raymi. So this picture is shortly after the celebration of the winter equinox, the rising of the sun, where we travel to this sacred hill or Apus, close to Jesus de Machaca. And there were blessings and celebrations connected to the first day of the new year in Aymara cosmology, which we will talk about that in a moment. So if we go to the next slide, please. When we talk about inequality, well, the question, of course, begins, what do we mean by inequality? And the last discussant talked in terms of inequality being a byproduct of failed institutions, as well as economic disarray in capital systems. But in Latin American terms, and surely in Bolivian terms, the sort of, if you allow me the expression, the original sin that leads to inequality in Latin America was colonialism. This picture that you see is a picture taken in the center of La Paz, one of the two capitals of Bolivia, and it's the way in which people currently are reconsidering images of the colonial period. In this case, Christopher Columbus. But this reconsideration and reevaluation of the impact of 500 plus years of colonialism is not unique to Bolivia. In fact, is a political concern that ties all of the peoples of the Americas. I chose a number of newspaper headlines highlighting how from the story from British Columbia, that not that long ago, where 250 remains of Native children were found in a Catholic church, and then also in the United States, we're quite familiar with Dakota Pipeline and the consequences to indigenous Native Americans, communities that lived in the path of that pipeline. In Central America, Nicaragua, the country where I was born, for quite a long time, even though the indigenous people of that region have political autonomy, nonetheless, they continue to face what they refer to as new colonialism, land disputes, people who encroach in indigenous land, mestizos, and then, of course, currently in Brazil, the administration of Bolsonaro has opened up significant inequalities in not only protection of human rights, but also use of native land. And the same thing in Chile, and we can talk about a number of different countries. You may be wondering why I put the headline for the outcome of a college football game from last week. And maybe that's a little silly, but it's also an important recognition that when one asks really anyone, surely in the United States, but particularly in Florida, the question of which tribe do you, connect to Florida. When you think about Florida, which tribe do you instinctively come to mind? Most people will answer the Seminole, but the reality is that the Seminole are not native to Florida. They themselves were implanted into the state in the mid 1700s, after they themselves became displaced from Oklahoma and other lands in the central United States. And so even in the area where I live, most people don't know about the original dominant tribe in Florida, which is the Calusa. And one of the reason is because there's no Calusa left. There's no Calusa people left alive. There's no Calusa language, and that's a byproduct of colonialization and genocide. So that's why it may be a silly news story to highlight the reality, the noxious consequences of colonialism in inequality in the native people of the continent of America. If you can go to the next slide, please. So why Bolivia? Because Bolivia, as I mentioned, as all of the countries really from Canada all the way to Patagonia, are considering at this time what political mechanisms are available to decolonialize politics, decolonialize their lives. And Bolivia has created one of the most progressive or radical, I guess I would say, I would use that term, constitutions. In 2009, under Evo Morales, they wrote what is now their 19th constitution, making the argument that from that moment forward, Bolivia would be a country that is constitutionally bound to find ways to create equality in the way that Thomas Jefferson wrote and that Lincoln talked about during the Gettysburg Address, when he said, 20 years ago, our fathers brought forth into this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all are created equal. Well, he said men, but the idea here is that when we think about inequality, at least for our time today, it all begins with equal treatment under the law, with equal citizenship. And throughout the region, throughout Latin America, surely in the case of Bolivia, that has not been a norm. And this constitution tries to rectify that in many different ways. Create create gateways for indigenous governance in ways that precede the birth of the nation state, in ways that precede the arrival of the Europeans, in ways that in the high Andes precedes also the rise of the Inca Empire, in terms of giving Aylus or the kinship communities in the high Andes the capacity to choose their leaders according to their way of life, according to all traditions. And it's a fascinating thing, document. It also, again, to sort of highlight what I mean by radical or progressive, it requires all people in this new constitution, that is, requires all people in Bolivia to learn to speak two languages, which in a way that doesn't sound too progressive. But what they've done is that people in Bolivia had to learn to speak Spanish and a native language, not just any native language, but also, but specifically the native language that is most commonly used in the region that they live. So if you want to think about it, for those of you that are listening in the Palouse, in primary, secondary, and high school, children will be required to learn not only English, but also the native language of the Spokane and other Native American tribes. And I think that's significant, that is a form of protection of not only all ways of speaking, it's all ways of thinking about culture and community, but also allows a certain amount of claim to be able to protect self-determination. That picture on the left of the screen is I took it coming from the airport in La Paz and going down into the city, and I liked it. I put it here because it's symbolic of this sort of attempt to create a new Bolivia. There's a number of important symbolisms in that monument. First off is the sort of the duality of the Aymara people, in which in all aspects of life, surely in the relationship at the house level, at the community level, at the territorial level, there's this duality where there's a counterpart, a male and female. But in Aymara terms, they're not really bound to turn to think about duality or gender, that is, in terms of male and female, because there's more to it than just the two binary genders as we know them. The Southern Cross, of course, is a significant Quechua and Aymara part of their cosmology. It's a star constellation, and the Huipala, which is the second now. Bolivia has two official flags. It's a multicolor flag that represents the argument, as for those of you that can read Spanish or some Spanish, that from that point forward, 2009, Bolivia is a plurinational country, and of course the two figures, the man and the woman, which again sort of represent the duality or the charmy-warmy part of Aymara cosmology, are in a sort of active pose, which represents indigenous resistance, which has been ongoing for more than 500 years. You can go on to the next slide, please. We'll go through a few slides that are just pictures of the election to sort of highlight what it looks like to you. If you pay attention, this is again the territorial election for the leader of the territory. You can see a man sort of facing what will be us, and everybody else is facing away. The man standing on a chair, and if you sort of follow, there's a long line that curves all the way to the left in a big curve on the background, and this is the way that the leaders were chosen out in the open. People, there were three different pairs, again, a man and a woman, that were running for that office for that year, which is a cyclical election, happens every year at the celebration of the New Year's Day. And so people openly lined up behind them, and they voted according to their choices. It was a party atmosphere. Everybody knew who was voting for, and that's how that couple was elected. If we go to the next slide. But of course, we're talking about political interaction. ILUs, as I mentioned, are the basic kinship communities in Aymara polity. That here, what's happening is that the two members of the young couple, you can see them, the man and the woman, are interacting with the members of one of the Aylus from Jesus de Machaca. And they're sort of doing the kind of stuff that you will see if you go to any sort of party event in pre-elections, in primary elections in the United States, electioneering, right? And I found it interesting. This may be, again, another silly thing to highlight, but they brought gifts. And of course, one of the interesting, most valuable gifts is Coca-Cola. We can talk about coca leaves, which is a sacred leaf to the Aymara people later on. If we go to the next slide. And of course, there's religion, as I mentioned. Aymara marca is the term for territory. And so, as I mentioned, religion and politics go hand in hand. This was a site where, before we entered the Aymara territory, the marca, the Jesus de Machaca marca, we were part of a ceremony to the Pachamama, and we had an Aymara priest do a celebration, a blessing for us. There's I'll tell you more a little bit later, but you can sort of see the high Andes in the background. What I want you to see in this picture is that there's remnants of a series of burnings. Not only ours. This is something that happens on a regular basis. This sort of connection with the Pachamama, which sometimes is translated as Mother Earth, which may not be fully descriptive in and of itself. It's ongoing, and it's happening more in the open now, largely because in Bolivia now these religious practices are protected by the Constitution, which again allows self-determination at the political and religious level. If we can go to the next slide, please, Richard. And of course, when we're talking about this marca, the territory is connected to one of the cradles of humanity, the region around Lake Titicaca. We're talking about governance and political systems that are very old. These are lentils, these are stone monuments that precede even Tiwanaku. And unfortunately, they're not really protected as they should. There's some that are standing. You can see the one on one side, and then there's others that are fallen down. And I think that's symbolic, again, of the impact, negative impact of colonialism in the life of the people in Jesus de Machaca, in Bolivia, and throughout Latin America. How this really valuable heritage to humanity were not deemed valuable, and so part of their history sort of fell to the ground. And again, this is one of the central messages of my talk, is that it begins with the negative impact of colonialism. If we can move on to the next slide. Here, we'll go through a series of slides with that sort of the foundation of my argument. If we look at inequality and colonialism. So as I mentioned, in agreement with the last speaker of this series, inequality is not only a failure of labor markets or chronic poverty around the world, surely in Latin America, but largely within the context of Bolivia and the continent, it's a failure of that is connected to the legacy of colonialism. And there's three Spanish terms that are connected to the way in which colonialism occurred in Spanish colonies and also in Portuguese colonies, castas, which is a system of hierarchy of in terms of race and ethnicity, that created rigid categories as to where people belong. With the very top, if you want to think sort of an upright pyramid, would be Europeans from the peninsula. Then the second lowest will be Europeans who were born in America, all the way down to the bottom being Indians. And then there were this, fascinating interconnections with really peculiar names. Some were, names like Lobos or Chinos, in terms of who mixed, which European mixed with whom. European with an indigenous was a mestizo, European with an African, some mulatto, and then there's all this, as you can see from this image on the right, all these different categories that, again, that were rigid at the time and continue to shape race and ethnic relations throughout Latin America to this day. Latifundio is a large land hacienda or land holding that is particularly used for agricultural purposes. And the latifundios really began with a system of encomienda, which was these arrangements between the Spanish crown and the Spaniards and the peninsula and the criollos, or the people Europeans who were born in America, that gave them a set of land and a set of native people, or indios, as they're referred to in Latin American and Spanish, for them to do as they please, slave labor and so forth and so on, that continue to create this in terms of inequality of ownership of land. That again, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but it's connected even to the way that land is understood to be held for economic development. Private ownership of land has to occur, but throughout the continent, surely in Bolivia, land is held communally, not by title. So there's this incongruity of the reality of ownership and land in Latin America and surely in Bolivia. And then encomienda was a corrupt system that continues to shape relationship, economic and personal, even in the region to this day. And of course, religion, in terms of Catholicism and the patriarchy, that define acceptable social norms in Latin America, continues to this day. Hopefully, I'm not going too fast through the slides. I'll be looking forward to sort of giving some more time to questions, but let's move on to the next slide. And of course, in Latin American terms, and surely in Bolivian terms, we have to acknowledge that inequality is also a byproduct of crisis of democracy. The graph on the right is an index that's updated every year by The Economist, a journal, that ranks countries around the world in terms of where they fall on this spectrum, from full democracies to totalitarian or authoritarian regimes. And you can see here that there's no full democracies in Latin America. In fact, the country that is the closest to on the higher end of the flawed democracy would be Costa Rica. Bolivia is closer to the middle of that distribution, where there's some yellow and light blue dots, right, or getting closer to a hybrid regime. And the reason why, the question is, why do we have a crisis of democracy throughout Latin America, is really, we have to consider two different factors, internal and external factors. Surely at the internal level, corruption, the role of patriarchy defining who is acceptable leaders, who can vote, which are some considerations that are not unique to Latin America. Surely in the United States, we can consider the reality that it wasn't until 1920 that women had the right to vote finally protected. Economic, for sure. The impact that the system of extraction of resources during the colonial period continues to be replicated in modern days or during globalization, with the system of dependency of periphery countries like Latin American countries to the core countries of the United States and Western Europe. And of course, for students of political science, of international relations, of U.S. foreign policy and Latin American politics, we have to talk about external or systemic explanations. How during the entirety of the Cold War, America defined political stability, United States, that is, defined political stability in the region, in Latin America, in terms of the type of government that would ensure that the so-called dominoes wouldn't fall anymore. And typically, of course, those tended to be dictatorships or military juntas. So that the systemic, the relationship between the regional hegemon serves to explain why that acted as a sort of retardant to democracy in the region. And of course, the issue of sort of modernization that goes hand in hand with the demands of neoliberalism and human development, presents a different sort of institutional understanding of what is normal, right? In terms of economic modalities, in terms of use of land, and so forth. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And then, of course, there is inequality and religion that, as I mentioned already, throughout Latin America and surely in Bolivia, there is a collusion of religion, particularly Catholicism, even though that's changing nowadays, and politics. There is this marriage that it leads to this interesting contradictions, as in the case of, for example, Nicaragua, that a country that, according to the Ortega regime, calls itself, socialist democracy and Catholic nation, that in a way in order to maintain itself in power, Daniel Ortega has acquiesced to some demands from the Catholic Church that itself then served to at least not be too much of an opposition, at least prior to 2018. And what I'm talking about is in terms of laws against abortion, right, in Nicaragua, making abortion illegal, particularly also foreign influence, as we're talking about, limiting the choice of whom people could vote in terms of the territory of the Aymara territory in Jesus Machaca, that also for quite a long time was an issue that needed resistance for people to be able in the region to be able to choose their leaders according to their old traditions that were, of course, tied not to Catholic religion, but the sort of Aymara cosmology. And of course, this sort of idea that the way in which stories are become the norm, become the authorized discourse, is very Gramscian in nature. In terms of, again, going back to Nicaragua, currently one of the crises, the ways in which inequality is occurring there and crisis of democracy is that the Ortega regime passed a new law, what they refer to as the terrorism law, that has been used to jail any really opponent, political opponent to Daniel Ortega, and in other ways, any opposition is deemed to be foreign influence, is deemed to be illegal, is deemed to be a form of terrorism. That allows, again, perpetuates inequality, that perpetuates the way in which politics and religion are, commingle. And what the outcomes of this sort of creates a crisis of legitimacy at the domestic level. In Bolivia, it means that really one can say a lot about Evo Morales, and we can surely say a lot of things if we have time during our classes, or not our class, I'm sorry, our question and answer period. But prior to that, and surely thereafter, from the perception of indigenous, native pueblos originarios in Bolivia, they were perceived to be as illegitimate. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. So you all should know that Evo Morales, while he claimed to have won election, the last presidential election, had to leave the country. And the new president, who claimed the right to hold the presidency, then set about to create a completely new cabinet. And in her new cabinet, there was not a single indigenous person left to run the government. So clearly a drastic change from not only a president who was indigenous, Aymara himself, but also had worked to create openings for the multitude of different indigenous people in Bolivia to be part of government at multiple levels. All of a sudden, there's none left. That is what I mean by a crisis of legitimacy. Any student of again, the Cold War period in Latin America would be familiar with Operation Condor, and we can talk about that in the question and answer period. If you don't mind moving to the next slide. And here is sort of, again, pictures that I took during my stay in Bolivia that sort of highlight in terms of the inequality in religious power in Bolivia. So on the left is the beginning of that altar that I told you we participated in a blessing ceremony to the Pachamama before we enter the Aymara Marca in Jesus de Machaca. You can see there on the top left the Aymara priest, whose name is Don Calixto, setting up a temporary altar. Right, there's this piece of paper that where you he began to sort of put different types of offering. Of course, it all begins with a layer of coca leaves, which are sacred leaf to the Aymara people and to the people of the high Andes. And then you accumulate a number of different layers of offering, and then that's put on top of a pyre and lit and burned. You saw the remnants of it in the earlier picture. So there's this altar that this form of altars that has existed for maybe 4,000 before our current era, but nonetheless temporary. And you can compare that with the altar at the Catholic Church in Jesus de Machaca, and you get the sense of political power, of permanence, and the capacity to use economic and colonial power to perpetuate one system of religion over another, right, with significant negative consequences to the expression of religion for the people of the region, which is also itself a form of inequality. If we move on to the next slide, please, and thank you. And of course, we also have to talk about inequality and gender identity and gender orientation. This is a picture from Bolivia, from a protest. And it reads, something that I'm just going to paraphrase. So for a long time, you spoke on my behalf. You thought of my behalf. You made decisions for me. Well, enough. Now I'm speaking my voice, and I'm no longer afraid. Again, this sort of expression of demand for access to the political arena, a demand of political and social and cultural agency in Bolivia really begins to expand with the drafting of the 2009 Constitution. And of course, it must be highlighted here that not only in Bolivia, really, but throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, we see some of the highest rates of femicide in the world. And of course, there's also, as I mentioned, a multitude of different factors that shape what is normal gender, not only gender behavior, not only female, but also gender behavior that create inequality in terms of the role of women in societies throughout the continent. If you think back to the picture, and I'm not going to ask to go back that far in the slides, but if you remember the picture that I showed you of the election, as I told you that the candidate stands on a chair, but it's only the man that stands on a chair. The woman is sort of there. So in some ways, while indigenous self-determination and governance allows for a return to this expected duality, equality of gender, in a lot of ways to this day, in Latin America, in Bolivia, and in the ILUs, it is the reality that women are sort of just accompanying their husbands in some of these political positions that continue to create a subordination of women, that continue to create and protect systems of inequality at all different levels, national, regional, and local. If we go to the next slide, and this is the last slide, again, the main theme here throughout my talk today is that considering what we mean by self-determination, indigenous self-determination in Bolivia, in Latin America, what we're talking about is the capacity to choose your own government, the capacity to protect your way of life, your language, your culture, that in a constitutional sense, that is what the 2009 Constitution means in terms of, from that moment forward, Bolivia will be committing to decolonializing all aspects of Bolivian life. And so, as I mentioned, colonialism and foreign intervention, because it was a retardant to self-determination in the continent, in the region, and at the local level as well, created inequalities that persist to this day. And for students of political science, surely the consideration comes that while we seek, and my point is that self-determination is a necessary foundation for equality to begin to be a reality, nonetheless, it presents a number of challenges to a number of political considerations. National sovereignty. How do you manage a country? How do you, as a state, as the government, in which self-determination for the original peoples of your nation means that they have political autonomy and decision-making to what is in reality a lot of important resources connected to land. So the central government loses some sovereignty. So self-determination is a domestic, has a negative impact to national sovereignty at the national level. And of course, to globalization. Globalization demands, in fact, the opening up of the economy largely, and also the political arena. That's in the case in the argument made by the Zapatistas in Chiapas in southern Mexico, when immediately the day after NAFTA was signed, globalization presents a problem to indigenous people throughout Latin America, to the original peoples of Latin America, in that they sort of become the sacrifice to that altar of the movement of transnational capital. And so how do you do globalization in a time in which the original people are more and more not only demanding self-determination, self-governance, but also have the constitutional mechanisms to make that a reality? And of course, when we talk about sort of modern nations, Westphalian nation states, this presents a problem. It becomes a question of, is the modern state as we know them in need to evolve in order to provide the context for indigenous self-governance and self-determination that, again, the main argument from my point of view is the basis to begin to ameliorate inequalities throughout the region. And as I talked about, a number of different types of inequalities. If you look at the picture on the right, I took that picture again in La Paz. La Paz is a very big city, but in a lot of ways it's also a complicated city, particularly when it comes to electricity. So this is an electrician who was called to resolve a power outage. and you sort of put yourself in the shoes of that electrician standing on that ladder. One of those wires is the reason for the outage, the electrical outage. But how do you figure out which, right? There's all this in Latin America, surely, as we talked a little bit about today about the example of Bolivia, there's this multiple forms of inequalities that are not only intersectional, but interconnected. And the problem is that they reinforce one another. Gender inequality reinforces political inequality. Political inequality reinforces on and on and on and on and on. And that's a challenge of our times. That's a challenge of the times for the people in Jesus de Machaca, whom were kind and resilient people from the little time that I spent with them. And I think that also applies to people in South America, Central America, North America, and the entire continent. That as I highlighted, or as I mentioned, rather, by the use of those news paper headlines, we're in a period of time in which the process of decolonization is a basic necessity for better governance, for democracy to expand, and at least when it comes to the original peoples of Latin America, it also really begins with self-governance and self-determination. And I think I'll stop at this time. I thank you for your time, and we'll move on to questions if everybody's ready. Again, I appreciate your time.
All right. Hey, thanks, Bruno. A lot of interesting information. You've pulled on a lot of different threads. I think since we don't have much time, I'm going to go straight to some of the questions from our audience members. One of our YouTube viewers asks, during the period of Evo Morales' presidency, indigenous participation clearly increased, as did indigenous recognition, especially through the new constitution, as you discussed. How has this been affected by the conservative coup and the subsequent political situation in Jesus de Machaca and in Bolivia more broadly?
Well, so from the perspective of the pueblos originarios of Bolivia, it was a shock, and it felt to them as a backward jump, not a step, but a huge jump. In that, as I mentioned, the perception was they were going to lose the capacity to hold government accountable and responsive at the national level. And the expectation was that would translate all the way down to the local government. So unfortunately, it sort of, from the perspective of the people of the original, the multitude of different peoples, the perception is sort of we're going back to the times of the gas wars, which you can Google that if even though we don't have time to talk about that. So it was perceived to be as a going back in time, if that answers the question.
Okay. Another question from Gus Waters here in Pullman. He asks, how might the movement for Bolivian indigenous self-determination be similar or different from the movement here in the United States?
Well, it's similar in again, that the common thread will be the need to decolonialize the lives of Native Americans in the United States. You don't need me to tell you this, but throughout the United States, some of the highest levels of poverty and inequality exist in indigenous or Native American reservations. So the challenge is similar in terms of our relationship of people who preceded the birth of the nation, having been unable to sort of, again, meet that very Lincolnian way of saying government of the people by the people. So it's similar in that there's an inability to have government that is responsive and accountable to the Native Americans as it is in Latin America. In terms of differences, I would say, I guess, that again, in this arrange in there, some Native American tribes have significant power in the United States, as in the case of the Seminole tribe in Florida, that I don't see in Latin America to that degree. Indigenous identity is really a relatively new phenomenon throughout the region in terms of being able to say, I'm a Chorotega, and this is an identity that matters to me, and an identity that's protected. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay. You said a little bit about this, but I wonder if you could expand a bit more on how you see the role of globalization playing into the struggle for equality in Bolivia and Latin America more generally.
Yeah, sure. So globalization, as I mentioned, assumes a number of different things. Assumes the removal of trade barriers, and those arrangements, as in the case of NAFTA and now the United States, Mexico, and Canada, I think that's what it's called, I don't remember the new term for it, are made without the consideration of the native people of the Americas. Oftentimes, they are sort of the losers of globalizations, if we were to talk about it that way. And particularly, the mechanism of globalizations demands development, and development really is tied to modernization. And modernization challenges old systems of life, old ways of political arrangements that are necessary in order to protect language, in order to protect culture in countries in Latin America. So globalization in some ways makes demands that are difficult for people of Latin America who are members of original nations to meet, largely because they don't have the same capacity to affect global trade or trade agreements as the nation state. And so globalization in many different ways makes demands of indigenous people that they're unable to keep, and end up in very real ways, real day-to-day considerations, having to make decisions that can affect the way. As an example, I'm not looking at the clock, but there's in Central America, there's the desire to create the new transoceanic canal that demands the movement of people who have lived in the regions that are in the path of the canal for thousands of years, and they're connected to that land. So we're talking about our people that have a connection to land that for non-natives is difficult for us to understand. If you're not connected to that land anymore, what happens to you is an existential concern. But nonetheless, that is one of the mechanisms to create development in some of these regions that goes along with globalization. I'm not sure if I'm making sense.
Oh, okay. So Anna Loudenbach asks whether the new constitution was implemented during the previous president Morales or the new president. And do you know why there are no indigenous people in the cabinet?
So yes, it was drafted and ratified under Evo Morales in 2009. The day that it was ratified, in fact, he used the celebration in terms of Aymara practices. So there was that. And what happened a couple of years ago is that after Evo Morales won what continues to be a contested election, really in an election in which he shouldn't have been running because he had extended constitutional limits for him running again, which was a way of me saying it was a problematic situation for him to be in. So he left the country. He was forced out of the country, and I believe it was the one of the top ministers. At this moment, my mind is failing me. She was constitutionally the right person to take the place of the president when in the chain of command, so to speak. And it was her choice then to create a cabinet, as it is for all incoming presidents everywhere in the world. And she, again, I don't know her. I don't have her on speed dial to say exactly this is why she did it. She had, as a legislator, she was a member of the National Assembly, had a difficult series of statements denigrating indigenous people. So she, as a person, is on the record having a difficulty understanding the role of indigenous people in Bolivian politics. And she simply made again, it was her right choice, the right to choose. She chose people to all the different levels of her cabinet, and none of them were of the indigenous at all. It was just her choice. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I have several more questions, but we have time for just one more, I think. This might be a good one to end with. Kat McKinney asks, what was the most interesting thing you learned in Bolivia that wasn't about politics?
Well, that's a good question. I think that the most fascinating thing for me was this idea that everything in politics and in everyday life must function in sort of in a dual nature, right? With a counterpart. There is at the family level, right? But the interesting thing about this sort of duality in Bolivian context is that gender is not understood to be simply male and female. One of the members of our delegation, who's a Quechua person, explained that there's been a number of cases in which the father of a family who has to be part of the village or the community leadership, right? Because every household sends a pair to make decisions in terms of consensus, right? That's what they mean by community democracy. All the decisions are made in terms of consensus. And typically it's a man and a woman, typically men, husband and wife or partners, right? But if, for example, a husband is dead and only has daughters, then one of the daughters will play the role of the man. And so gender becomes fluid in that sense, in that for that period, for that year, that woman will play the role of a man in every aspect of her life. It's the way she put it. So to me, I guess that connection that is not really political, not only cultural, but also cosmological, right, was difficult to understand and fascinating.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, I think our time's up. Before I thank our guest, let me remind the audience that our next event is scheduled for Wednesday, September 29th at noon. We have Professor Jim Gibson from Washington University in St. Louis. He'll be talking about his new book. It just barely came out, entitled Judging Inequality, the Role of Courts. So I encourage you to join us for that. Now I want to thank Bruno Baltodano for a terrific discussion, and I'm glad I'm so glad we could have him back to the Foley Institute. And let me thank all of you for tuning in today, and I hope to see you in 2 weeks at our next event. Thanks very much.